This is the golden question. Hello, guys. Welcome to episode 10 of the Golden Question podcast. We finally reached 10 of these, and I'm looking forward to, reaching 50, 100 of these episodes, and keep pushing out information that unfortunately is the contrarian view. I mean, there are a small minority that believe in what I believe, and mainly because of them, because of me personally listening to them, I've formulated my own belief based on their belief. And I've realized that a lot of the stuff that the minority says in the case of talking about, economic policy, monetary policy, as well as, a little bit of fiscal policy, it makes common sense. When somebody tells you you need to save money, you can't go into debt, this stuff isn't rocket science. However, when you listen to the opposing view, which sort of finds ways to justify debt, which finds ways to, justify government intervention, it just ends up being convoluted, and it doesn't make sense to the normal, your normal man, and it doesn't make sense, and it's designed that way, and just the idea of studying government and studying politics and looking at the way that the tax law is structured and looking at the way regulations are, it's all confusing. It doesn't make sense. And it's designed that way, so it doesn't make sense to you, so that you sort of deter yourself from trying to actually understand it, and little by little it takes over, and it's too late to then try to understand it. But today in this podcast, I want to ask the question: what is this coronavirus exposing? And in terms of the economy as well as social life, because again, I do believe that the economy and society, in terms of our sociological interactions, have a lot in common. So what this coronavirus is exposing, and we're seeing it with the protests outside of major the town halls around the states, Texas, Michigan, and even New York. Surprisingly, even New York. And what this is exposing is people's lack of savings, and again, that's the main culprit, is the lack of savings. But what fuels the lack of savings is your inclination to consume debt. So, and then again, reasons why people consume debt could be due to rising prices. And how are prices rising? Through inflation and through obviously government red tape. All these regulations, which makes the cost of doing business more expensive, which makes prices go up, which then inclines people to go into debt more. So you're seeing this huge cycle, right? There's a lot of different factors into somebody going into debt, but I'm not going to blame it on the person for going into debt. Yes, going into debt, you shouldn't go into debt, and you should try to avoid it as much as possible, but you should then ask the question, why are they going into debt? Because that's the side effect of a much deeper problem, and that resides into how the government is actually enticing people. It's actually encouraging people to go deeper into debt. Now, again, there's obviously a bunch of self-help books out there that talk about debt. You have Dave Ramsey, who's done years and years of podcasts explaining the problems with debt. But unfortunately, those people lack is they talk about debt on a personal level, but then they don't just zoom out a little bit and look at it on a much broader lens. Right? Dave Ramsey thinks these stimulus checks are okay. I mean, he's saying don't depend on them, but he's sort of justifying it. He's saying the government should be doing this. And he doesn't see the problem of debt on a government scale. And he doesn't see it on a much larger economic scale in terms of corporations and businesses themselves going into debt. Because if going into debt on a personal level is bad, then it's just as bad as someone doing it on a business level, a corporate level, or even a nation level, right? On a government level. And unfortunately, people, I'm not singling out Dave Ramsey, I'm singling out a lot of these self-help books and people that try to help you avoid debt, but they don't take the second to zoom out in the picture and say, wait, why are these people consuming debt? Yes, it's bad, and yes, people shouldn't do it, but the question is, why are they falling victim to it? And you can see that once you dig deeper, you find out that a lot of the problem is from the government and the Federal Reserve, which again we're lumping into the same basket as the government. And now, this also asks a much deeper question, in my opinion, and it's really the failure of paper money, fiat currency. Because at the end of the day, fiat currency, paper money, has no value, right? No intrinsic value. And again, just what do I mean by intrinsic value? Meaning, in and of itself, regardless if anybody else wants your dollars, could you do anything with those dollars besides make a fire with it or use it as paper, right? There really is no value in that. And again, take it if you're locked up in an island in the middle of the ocean. If somebody gave you a bunch of dollars and told you to work for him, and let's say you did work for him, those dollars that he's giving you in return aren't going to do you any good. So again, this is simple money policy idea where money in and of itself doesn't have any value. It's what money can buy you. But unfortunately, with using fiat currency and paper money as a form of money, the reason why societies avoided using it, and it's sort of like a new invention with paper money, and why it's failed so many times, is that when you have paper money, it fails one of the most important tests, in my opinion, of money, and that is the store value. It doesn't have a store value. Why? Because it's easily creatable. You could easily duplicate it and create it without any effort, right? And I've mentioned the previous podcast about what makes counterfeiting money wrong, right? If the government can go ahead and print money and justify it by saying it's going to help the economy, what makes it wrong for an individual who decides, you know what, I want to help the economy and let me print as much money as I can so I can go ahead and give it to my businesses and somehow jog up the economy. But there's again a lot of factors of money, and surprisingly gold, and it's really a miracle how gold is the only metal so far that really satisfies all those characteristics of money. But an important characteristic is gold can't be created. You have whatever gold you have in the economy, and that's it. Or whatever gold is in the earth. And yes, you can keep mining it, and there are there's a bunch of gold still left unmined, but it still takes effort to mine that gold. You can't just find gold in trees and somehow it'll be easy to just climb up a tree and grab it. There's a lot of effort, a lot of expenses that go into mining gold. And that's, in my opinion, what gives it a little bit of its intrinsic value. Apart from, what you could do with dentistry and medicine and electronics and jewelry. So apart from that, what gives it its intrinsic value is you actually have to work to acquire it. And so that effort that you put into acquiring the gold gets translated into its value and at its basic level. Now, obviously, just because I worked for something, it doesn't mean it gives it value. But at the most basic level for gold, it does have that intrinsic value where it requires effort to acquire it, and then it fulfills all the other characteristics of gold. So in terms of money, when you have something that actually requires effort to acquire it, then the work that you put in is justified into placing that value on the money. But again, that only works for money, and that's the important key here, is that obviously if I work several hours to write a book and nobody wants my book, then obviously it has no value. But in terms of money, when you have something that you actually takes effort and work to acquire, and it fulfills all the other characteristics of money, then it gives it that special attribute of it gives it a higher level status than using anything else that may also fulfill those characteristics of money. And what we're seeing here is with this coronavirus, it's really exposing the the structural flaws of having an economy based on this paper currency. And I never heard anybody say this from this perspective, but I feel like a big reason why people are going into debt and loaning out money to individuals who are willing to go into debt, and even individuals not saving money and just recklessly spending it, is because our entire system revolves around this piece of paper that you yourself know that intrinsically it has no value. So you don't put a lot of effort into spending it. And now we're seeing, obviously, we're moving into the digital realm of sort of digital dollars. It's not really a digital currency, but it's dollars that are just in numbers, and you just use your card to buy things. And I mean, there are several tests that have been done to show that somebody who uses a physical paper to physical dollar papers to purchase things does so more reluctantly than if one were to do it with the debit card. Because at least with dollars, you know how much you're spending, you get to feel it in your hand, and when you give it to the waiter, once you, and I think Dave Ramsey gave this analogy as well, when you give that Benjamin, you put it down on the table, and then that waiter comes, picks it up, and walks away with it. There's a feeling in there that you've worked hard for something, and now she's taking it away from you. So you're less reluctant to spend and spend to an extent. And this applies to on a much broader scale, where if you're placing down on that table, right? Let's say you just finished your meal at this restaurant and you're placing down a piece of paper, but then in your head you're like, oh, you know what? That's just a piece of paper. Who cares? But if you were placing down a gold coin that you know is limited in quantity in the earth, you can't make it out of thin air, and you see that waiter come and take your gold coin and walk away with it, you're even more reluctant to spend. And I think because we have this paper currency, this paper money that is just made out of paper, there is no intrinsic value in it. The government can just print it out of thin air. There really is no reason for you to justify yourself into saving, right? You're working hard and you're saving your money, but what are you saving it into? You're just saving it with a bunch of dollars that, right, you just hope that somebody else wants in the future. But if you were actually working hard and you saved your effort and your labor in gold, right, into a metal that you know is limited in value, it fulfills all the characteristics of money, it takes effort for someone to mine it, and it can't be created out of thin air from central banks, you tend to spend your money more carefully. And you probably aren't going to be willing to just loan your money out to someone who just happens to need your money, and he's going to promise to pay you back. Let's say you have a gold coin and he wants to borrow your gold coin, and he'll give you back a gold coin and a sliver of a coin or whatever as interest. You're probably not going to want to give it to him. And this also ties into the aspect of debt, right? If you're giving these banks your gold to hold, to store, first of all, you're not going to want to give your gold to a bank that uses your gold to then loan it out and then to speculate with it and to make their own investments. The primary purpose of you putting your gold into a bank is to have it stored there. And the only revenue for the bank might be like a storage fee. And essentially the bank is just going to be a storage facility, right? Just like a goldsmith. It's probably not, in this day and age, it probably won't make the gold. It won't actually refine it. Some other company will do that. But all it'll do is just be a storage of gold. And it'll have it on its balance sheet. And obviously your gold isn't going to have your inscription on it. It's not going to have your signature on it. But what they do is they just have a reserve of gold, and then you could exchange currency. But again, that currency is going to be backed by that gold. So again, as I said, when you give someone, let's say they worked for an hour, and you give them two scenarios. When you give them a piece of paper for all the work that they've done, they're less reluctant to spending it. They could easily go around spending it because they know that it's just a piece of paper. There is no intrinsic value. They can't do anything with that, so they might as well just spend it. And you see with these low interest rates, and again, low as in people are easily, money's readily available. People are it's very easy to convince someone to lend you money. And it's because you have this paper currency system that people don't really care about what they do with it, right? And again, this is how the system is set up so that the government itself can extract actual resources from the economy, and in return just give everybody these paper dollars, these paper whatever it could be, right? And it can then create that thing out of thin air and convince everyone that it's actually doing good for the economy. So what we're starting to see is sort of, in my opinion, our last couple of years or decades with this fiat currency system. And again, the fact that I'm waking up to this, I'm telling my parents this, they're also realizing, why am I working all these hours and providing a good and service to society, and what is society giving me in return? These paper dollars that don't have any intrinsic value at all, and that I could easily go to a bank and somebody could just give me dollars. Why do I have to work if somebody else is easily willing to give their own savings out, right? And again, when you go to the bank and the bank gives you money, loans you money, the money that the bank is giving you theoretically is from somebody else who saved his money. So he took his hard-earned capital, his savings, and giving it to the bank, and now the bank just easily, willy-nilly gives it out to people. Obviously, the bank is going to need to check, your credit score and what have you, but at the end of the day, they're still just giving you the money in hopes that they would make a return, and if they don't, then they lose the money, and that person who worked hard for it, who gave the money to the bank and put his money as a deposit in the bank, loses his hard-earned savings. But if we had a system where people actually transacted in gold, first of all, that person will be extremely reluctant into giving the bank his gold. And if he did give the bank his gold, he'll make sure he knows exactly what the bank is doing with his gold. And maybe he'll probably not want his bank to make any investments. He'll just want his gold stored in there because at any moment he wants to be able to go and pick up that gold. And banks themselves, obviously, they're going to not lend out gold to just random people looking for money at the moment, right? They just want money now. They don't want to work for it, so they go into debt. And again, this is the entire debt structure, and we wouldn't have this entire debt structure if it was on a gold standard. But because we're in this fiat currency system, we are in this paper currency system, the creation of debt is fueled, and sooner or later it's going to collapse because people are going to realize, why am I working? Why am I creating all these goods and services so that I can, in return, just get a piece of paper? And if they are getting a piece of paper, right, then they wouldn't care about what to do with it. They'll easily lend it out to people. They'll speculate with it. And it just has a trickle-down effect where the entire economy just becomes slaves to debt itself. And sort of the way I look at it is it's sort of a byproduct in a way of the fiat currency, right? This paper money creates this society that just is enslaved to debt. Now, you could be enslaved to your savings in a way. Again, I'm saying that term metaphorically. And what I mean by that is, if, again, as we all know, your income could come and go at any moment, okay? But if you had the option to, if your income goes, what would you rather be left with? Would you rather be left with debt, or would you rather be left with savings, right? Your savings and your debt stay no matter what, right? Even if it's a rainy day, you still have your savings. And even if it's a rainy day, you still have your debt. Your income might go during the rainy day. And again, rainy day is just a metaphor for any crisis that might occur. But if you're left with just your debt, again, you still have to work in the future. You're sort of enslaved to owe someone back the goods and services that he lent you in the terms of money. And if you had your savings, you don't owe anybody anything. You actually owe it to yourself now to use your savings to help you survive. And again, this is just when I explain this to people, I always stop and ask them, is this common sense? Like, am I saying something that's extremely controversial? Is it something that's extremely out of the ordinary? Like, is this something that sort of is confusing you? And they all say, everybody who I tell this to, mainly my parents, they all agree with me. They say, I mean, that's just common sense, right? Savings is better than debt. But then you have to go ahead and ask yourself, why are people not saving? Why are people going into debt? It's because we're using this paper fiat currency, right? What's the whole point of saving paper, right? People are now reluctant to just spend, right? That's why people try to get out of cash. I mean, the saying cash is trash probably doesn't have the connotation that I'm implying, but in my theory, it works out it makes just as much sense as it would. Your cash has no use for you just sitting there because it's just cash. And you might as well just go ahead and spend money, and then even in that matter, if you spent all of it, just go into debt to acquire goods and services. But when you have gold, you would be saving your money. You would be making sure to spend your money on things that are only absolutely necessary, not just on stupid, idiotic things that you probably wouldn't have spent. You would have spent your money on if you were using cash. And also, when you're lending your money out, you probably wouldn't even lend money at all, right? Unless you're investing in a business, unless you're investing in someone in which you're gonna get a royalty, or you're gonna gain a percentage of the company. Essentially, investing in that sense is not. You can't compare investing to debt, because when you're putting your money into debt, there really is no. Again, there is recourse, liabilities, but even in that sense, your only gain is to make sure you get the money back. You don't care how he does financially. All you care about is as long as you get your money back and maybe a little bit extra. But again, that wouldn't be the case if we were running on a gold standard. People would be much more reluctant giving their money out. People would be saving their money. Everybody who'd buy anything would buy it with the gold that they have saved up, so there would be no need for credit cards. Businesses, on the other hand, would make sure they have the savings before they take up the risk to start their own business, right? The idea that a small business needs to get a loan to get going is obviously false. And so, I mean, no matter where you look at it, debt really isn't necessary at all. And I'm trying to stop myself from talking about religion and how this also sort of agrees with what religion teaches us in what we see in the Bible and the Quran, and how God has prohibited people from using interest, in a way, from using debt, right? You can give money to someone else and take ownership in whatever they have, but the idea that you're just going to give them money and they're going to give you that money in return plus interest is something that we're sort of seeing right now what that system eventually will lead up to. And in this case, it leads up to, first of all, you're using a fiat currency. So you don't really care about savings. You just want to consume as much as possible. You want to convert those dollars that you have into actual goods, because that's what actually matters. What matters is the goods and services that you have, not the paper money that you have. And then people go into debt, and there's really no need to save. So once people stop saving and a crisis hits, then all of a sudden they're sort of left out in the cold, right? Skinless. the only way for you to survive now is to then, because you're using the paper fiat currency, let the government print money and give it to you now. And then you could start questioning, wait a second, if the government just can create this wealth out of thin air, why am I working hard to create wealth for myself? And then we see the system collapse. So inevitably it will collapse. You can never have a sustainable economy that's based on a fiat currency, because it'll lead up to debt, and governments grow with that debt and with the establishment of fiat currency. So I think this is a wake-up call. When you look at these protests, just know that a lot of them don't have savings. That's why they're protesting. They want to go back to work. They want to keep making money, living paycheck to paycheck. And if we did have savings, we wouldn't be in this mess. If we did have savings, individuals would be able to survive off their savings for at least a week or a couple of weeks, right? The idea is you should have enough savings for 6 months of expense. I mean, nobody follows by that rule anymore now. People are living paycheck, and in fact, people are actually in debt, so they owe people money. They're living less than paycheck to paycheck. They're going to debt so that they can cover the difference that they need. And then you see businesses also go highly levered, going into debt. And so again, when the crisis hits and the customers stop flowing through the doors, now they're left with the debt. They have no savings. The workers now, unfortunately, are going to get laid off. And the workers themselves now need the job even more because they themselves don't have savings. And even from a government perspective, the government now doesn't have a lot of lacks now the revenue. So then the government's only left with its debt, and the only way for this cycle to keep going is for the government now to obviously incur more debt, to push out more bonds and treasuries, and to ask the Fed to spur up the printing press. So this whole system is collapsing because of debt, no matter where you look at it. And I think this virus is showing us that you need to have funds for a rainy day, but you're only going to have funds in a rainy day if you have something that you actually want to save and something that you want to work hard for, and that is gold. If you have paper currency, nobody's going to save paper currency. Nobody's going to, in the right mind, would even try to save paper currency. They're going to try to spend it as much as possible because they'd rather actually save the goods that the paper currency buys them than the paper currency itself. So I really hope people wake up, and obviously you're already seeing the cycle continue. The government tries now to keep everybody to keep spending, giving people money now to spend, trying to continue people to keep borrowing money. They're giving now reserves to the banks to keep letting banks dole out money. And unfortunately, again, the cycle, we may somehow theoretically be able to continue to inflate this bubble, but eventually it will pop. And I would rather it pop now than 10, 20 years from now. But as long as we know that we're getting closer, because these crises are going to come in the future. You're going to have certain crises that come. This virus is a perfect example. We might get another virus in the future. And if you don't have savings, any crisis will become a big crisis. Instead of this crisis just being a small bump on the road, because obviously people are not going out buying, and you're going to start eating away at your savings, which is, you're losing money. People are losing wealth. But it didn't have to go to this extent where people outside are protesting. People now need money from the government, and there's even bread lines out there. Not bread lines, but there was actually people lining up in cars trying to get food. It shouldn't get to this extent, and this entire system is based on the failure of fiat currency and debt. Hopefully that summed it up for you guys. Stay tuned for episode 11 and stay safe. And I should add stay savings at the end of this, but I don't want this turning into a Dave Ramsey podcast. But anyways, I'll see you guys later. Before I end this, I just want to add another thing. I always have stuff to add when I finish the recording. So if this bothers you, I'm sorry. I'll try to get my ideas formulated into that recording before I have to add anything to it. Something that came across my mind is when you go into debt with someone, what you're essentially doing is you're using their savings for your benefit. And the way I look at it is, when they worked hard, let's say they worked for a week and they got $100 and they decided to save that and not spend it. You, on the other hand, hasn't even worked yet, and yet you want to buy something that you don't have the funds for. So what you do is you go ahead and take money from someone else to pay for your thing. And again, that's essentially what debt is. And now you not only have to pay back what you borrowed from him, but you have to pay back a little bit extra. So now you're even worse off, right? You could have just spent $10 on something, or in this case, let's say the 100. You could have spent $100 on whatever you needed to spend on, and you could have worked for $100. But now you end up spending more money, which translates to you just ended up working more to acquire that good or service than you would have if you would have just worked for it and acquired it. But then again, you wouldn't have acquired it now. You would have actually had to wait a little bit to work for it and then to acquire it. So when you add on the interest, again, you end up working on principal more than you would have if you would have just done the work for just the principal amount of the good or service. So on your end, you're worse off, and you're taking his savings. He is preventing himself from buying a good and service right away. So what he's doing is he might be able to, he's probably saving for something that's even more valuable than what he can work for, let's say, for a week. So he's working for a week, and he makes $100. And let's say he wants to buy something that's $300. Obviously, he can't afford it, but guess what? If he works another week for $100, now he can pay for that thing. So he's saving to enrich himself by buying something that it isn't affordable to him yet, but in the future it will. And what you're doing is you're essentially taking that wealth away from him. When you're going into debt, you're borrowing money from people. You're taking money away from savers. And this is, again, why this debt structure is extremely, in my opinion, immoral and unjust. So I'll just leave it at that. I guess we can go into further episodes and podcasts discussing more about debt and why it's bad, but also discussing why it's being implemented. Again, it's not just because it's bad, because people and people shouldn't do it. It's why are people subscribing to the idea of debt? So stay tuned for the next episode, and I hope you guys stay safe.